All right, so welcome to those of you who are clocking in for this lecture. This lecture is going to be all about energy, as far as the uh, acquisition and use of energy by living organisms and the process of metabolism, more specific cellular metabolism. Now, virtually every living organism requires energy in order to perform some task. Um, when we were talking about the basic or universal principles that all living things have, one of those principles is the ability to um, obtain and use energy. So, energy is used again virtually for everything with living organisms. We use energy to think, exercise, and even sleep. The same holds true for our cells. The various processes that occur within or around a cell, they all require energy. So where does energy come from? How do we obtain it? Um, well, you kind of ask the same question of cells. How do cells obtain energy and how do they use it? Well, energy is obtained and transferred through a very intricate network of interactions um, regarding energy transfers and energy transmission between organisms. So you have different types of organisms. There's autotrophs and there's heterotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms that are able to generate their own source of energy. Heterotrophs are organisms that um, require the consumption of other organisms in order to obtain energy. Plants are your autotrophs, whereas us humans and other mammals were heterotrophs. So plants capture solar energy, they convert that energy into the production of sugars. Your uh, primary consumers, which are your kind of first tier of heterotrophs, will eat plant matter and they obtain a partial percentage of that energy from the plants and use that as fuel for their body, and the cells will use that obtained energy as fuel, and some of it is released as heat. And then your kind of tertiary consumers, secondary and tertiary, which are your larger carnivores, will eat those primary consumers, and by doing so, they obtain a partial percentage of the energy from that individual. So life is built on kind of these different chemical reactions and the flow of energy through living systems, right? So the acquisition of energy and then the transformation of it into one form and another that can then be transferred between living entities. That's kind of how we obtain energy. It's either obtained kind of by the organism, or produced, I should say, by the organism itself, or we have to acquire it from a secondary source. Now, um, cellular processes, per se, kind of going from organism level, stepping down several tiers on the cellular hierarchy to the level of cells. Cellular processes occur through these stepwise chemical reactions. And this kind of stepwise process is actually very efficient. That's why it is an enduring trait. We call it metabolism. So a cell's metabolism is basically the summation of all the chemical processes and reactions that occur in these living organisms. In other words, it's the combination of chemical reactions that take place within that cell, uh, and allow it to, or enable it to produce energy as well as consume energy. So it fuels energy production and consumption. Now, the actual kind of pathway through which these reactions occur is known as the metabolic pathway. A metabolic pathway is a series of chemical reactions that takes a starting molecule or your starting material and modifies it through a series of successional steps. And in those steps, it creates these series of intermediates or metabolic intermediates before finally and ultimately yielding a final product. So that's what metabolism is. It's again this culmination or summation of all of these chemical reactions that are occurring in the body that allow the breakdown of products that can be used for consumption and production of energy in cells and ultimately by the entire organism. Now, your pathways, your metabolic pathways, there's kind of two types. They can either be what we call anabolic pathways or catabolic pathways. Anabolic pathways are synthesis reactions. So these are processes that build complex molecules out of simpler ones. So you're going from small to large. You're putting the little pieces, little Lego pieces together to build a spaceship. And in order to go from small to large, in order to create that larger product, it requires the input of energy, right? It's just like the process where you go from monomers to polymers. When you put many monomers together, you get a polymer, right? That's an anabolic pathway. That's an anabolic process. And when you're linking those monomers, the actual linkage or formation of the linkage between each requires energy. The same case with all anabolic pathways. So in order to function on an anabolic pathway or to go through anabolic synthesis, you need energy put into the system. The other type of pathway are your catabolic pathways. So catabolic pathways are more of your degradative pathways or degenerative, in that it deals with or comprises the breakdown of complex molecules or compounds into simpler ones, right? So this is going from that large polymer and breaking that polymer down into its individual monomer units. So you're going from large to small. And that process, in order to do that, requires breaking bonds. So by breaking bonds, you're releasing energy. So here, catabolism, you're going from large products to their small individual components. That requires breaking bonds, so it releases energy. So these are energy yielding metabolic pathways. Your anabolic pathways, on the other hand, deals with putting small compounds together to make a large compound. In order to do that, you have to build bonds or make bonds, form them between the molecules. And forming bonds requires energy, right? So energy is lost. You have to put energy into the system for your anabolic or biosynthetic metabolic pathways. So those are the two major types. We can talk about some examples to kind of make it more familiar or allow you to kind of wrap your head around it a little better. So we can think of catabolic reactions. Again, these where we're breaking large substances down. Think of digestion, right? Digestion of sugar, for example. So living things consume sugar as a major energy source. It's a very short-term energy source, but it's the primary source of energy because it goes immediately into cellular respiration. It works very well as an electron transporter. So we take in sugar as an energy source. Again, because those molecules have a great deal of energy, and that energy is stored in the bonds. So if you take in a complex carbohydrate or a polysaccharide that's created by the linkage of many, many, many monomers together, each glycosidic linkage between those individual monosaccharides, right? Monosaccharides are the monomers. The linkage between the monomers are the glycosidic linkages. Each of those linkages store a tremendous amount of energy. So that represents potential energy. So when those sugars enter your digestive system, they are broken down into the monomer forms, forms that can actually be utilized by the body, right? So we break them down into the individual glucose monomers, which is a simple sugar. And that allows for the release of energy that could then be captured and harnessed to fuel cellular activity. So digestion, again, you're breaking down food, you're digesting food, that's breaking these large compounds into small individual molecules, that's all releasing energy. That's why digestion is so important to us, because one, it gives us products that can be used for other functions in the body, but also because we obtain energy from the breakdown of food. Some of your anabolic pathways or your biosynthetic processes. So you can think of synthesizing sugar from carbon dioxide. What happens in plants, right? That's an anabolic pathway. Creating large proteins from amino acid building blocks, the synthesis of DNA strands from nucleic acid building blocks. Those are all anabolic pathways. They require the input of energy to go from an individual monomer to a polymer or a larger molecule that's composed of the linkage of these smaller individual components. So hopefully that makes it a little easier for you to understand. This is a nice picture to kind of give you a visual of what I'm talking about. Again, with your anabolic, we'll talk about what endergonic and exergonic mean in a bit, but right now just focus on the anabolic and catabolic. So anabolic, you're taking your little building blocks and you're putting in energy, and that gives you this large compound, right? So you're putting things together. In order to put them together, you need energy to form bonds, and then you get your product. Here, you're taking a product, kind of the same product from a previous anabolic reaction, and you're breaking it down into its individual molecules or individual monomers, and in order to do that, you're breaking bonds, and that releases energy. So here, cells are gaining energy. Here, you're losing energy. All right, so as I was saying before, all living things require energy. So we were just talking about metabolism, which is a way that energy is consumed and produced, which is great, but what exactly is energy? Well, we can start off with kind of the study of energy. That deals with bioenergetics. Bioenergetics is the study of energy flows through living systems. So what we were talking about before, kind of the transfer of energy from one organism to another through a series of transformations. Now, energy itself is defined as the ability to do work, right? Energy is work, it has the capacity to also cause change. And again, in everyday life, we use different forms of energy to create or do work. So this would be moving objects, or kind of consuming energy in order to replenish lost energetic stores. Now, energy exists in various forms, and it's kind of transformed in different states or different forms from cell to cell. These cells can also, within each cell, can transform energy from one type to another. The two kind of major categories as far as the forms of energy are kinetic and potential. Kinetic energy refers to energy that's associated with objects in motion. This is because objects that are in motion can perform work. They can do that by kind of displacing or imparting the energy kind of pertaining to that motion onto other forms of matter. So kinetic is, again, energy that's associated with objects in motion. So some examples are heat or thermal energy. The reason why that is a type of kinetic energy is because it's associated with these random movements of atoms and or molecules. So if it's moving, if it has motion, that's kinetic, right? Kinetic is energy of motion. The second type is potential. So potential energy stems from objects that are not in motion. These are kind of energy that comes from objects that are held in place. It's easy to remember because this type of energy refers to the potential to do work. When that energy is harnessed, it can be changed to allow work, or it can be shifted from potential into a kinetic source, and when it's kinetic, it will release energy. So it's energy that's not in motion, but has the potential to do work when it does go into motion. So you can think of water behind a dam, right? As that water pushes up against the dam, it's building up high and higher amounts of energy, right? There's a lot of pressure that's being held back by that dam based on the water pressure. Now, if that dam breaks, you have the sudden release of water. Now the water has kinetic energy, right? It's moving. So when water is trapped behind a dam and is held behind the dam, it's potential. That energy there is potential energy. When you have the breakage of the dam and the water moves kind of through the dam, you have your kinetic energy. Now, the reason why these, when we're talking on a kind of a cellular and molecular level, the reason why molecules are able to possess energy, why they have potential energy, is because of the arrangement of their atoms. Again, molecules are composed of many different atoms. In order to create that molecule requires bonds. So the formation of those bonds requires energy, but each bond represents a source of stored energy, right? You break a bond, that releases that energy. So the bond itself is potential energy. Breaking the bond, once it's broken and releases energy, it becomes kinetic energy, right? So chemical energy is your of good form of potential energy, because it's potential energy that's stored in molecules because of their anatomic arrangement, because they are bonded or created by different atoms that are bonded together. Now, your two energy types, they can interchange. So as I was saying, you can have the transformation from source of potential energy into kinetic energy, right? And that's kind of how energy flows and operates through all living systems, through series of energy transformations, right? Energy is stored, and then we break down certain molecules to obtain energy, or we use energy to reform molecules, and that's what is occurring in cells. So chemical energy initially, when it's stored in your bonds, again, that's your potential energy. It's being stored. When you break those bonds, for example, through digestion, you get kinetic energy that can then is now your energy in motion and can be used for other sources. So on the cellular level, right, the kinetic energy that's generated by the passive diffusion of one molecule down its concentration gradient across the membrane can serve as the fuel that powers the active transport or secondary active transport of a different atom or molecule across the membrane going up its concentration gradient, right? So you can now harness and actually utilize these released forms of energy. Some other examples. So a boy climbs the stairs to this diving platform, right? And he's on the diving platform. Right now, he's just standing there, but he has potential energy, right? He's storing energy that has the potential to allow for work. And while he's kind of standing on that platform, he's again so kind of backing up here. He's climbing up the ladder, right? That's kinetic energy. He's losing energy because it's breaking down different molecules, and it requires the consumption of different molecules to fuel that activity. But once he stops moving, you can have kind of this conversion of kinetic energy from the muscle movement back to potential energy. So when he's on the diving board, you have potential energy. When he jumps off the diving board and dives into the water, you have the conversion of that potential energy back into kinetic, right? So kinetic energy is then transferred to the water as the boy enters it, and some of that energy is converted to heat due to the friction of the boy body hitting the water, and also the breaking of the surface tension against the air-water interface. So again, everything involves these transformations between different kinds of energy, and that's how food webs operate, right? Food webs operate based on the energy transfers between different trophic levels of ecosystems. So here are your primary producers. They create and store energy. So that energy that they've created and are now storing, that's potential energy. That potential energy can then be passed on to your primary producer, and then that primary consumer, your primary consumer will capture that part of that energy, store it, and then that stored energy can be passed on to the next species that eats it. So that's how energy is passed on. And again, it's going through different transformational stages, kind of going back and forth between kinetic and potential energy. So as energy is being transferred between organisms, you have kinetic energy. When an organism is storing energy after it's been consumed, that's potential. Now, when we're talking about these energy transformations, right, that's all relative to thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is the study of energy transformations that occur between living organisms or different forms of matter. And there's kind of two laws. Well, there are two laws that we will talk about relative to thermodynamics. There's the first law and second law. Now, the first law of thermodynamics states that the energy of the universe is constant, right? It's energy can be transferred and transformed, but it cannot be created or destroyed. Right? We also refer to this as kind of the principle of conservation of energy. So basically what it's referring to is that the kind of the total amount of energy in the universe is a constant and conserved value, right? There's always been that amount of energy. There always will be about that amount of energy. It will remain unchanged. There will always be the same amount of energy in the universe. And that energy can be transferred from one place to another or transformed into different forms, but it cannot be created or destroyed. Right? That's the major component, again, as I had said before. First law of thermodynamics states that energy can be transferred and transformed, but not created or destroyed. So when we talk about living things or in studying energy, we're really referring to how energy is transferred between different forms of matter and the environment, or between different systems. Right? Your system can either be the cell, it can be the environment, it can be a different organism, etc. Now, living cells have evolved to meet this challenge. Chemical energy stored within organic molecules such as sugars and fats are transformed and transferred, again, through a series of chemical or cellular chemical reactions. That series of reactions, again, metabolism. And that works to transform that energy that was consumed or initially obtained into energy that is then stored within the molecules of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Those molecules store a tremendous amount of energy. So again, it represents a wonderful source of a high amount of potential energy. Now, the molecules of ATP, they can be broken apart, which enables the release of that energy. So now you have kinetic energy. And that energy is harnessed by the cells to fuel work. So when we talk about cells and kind of the cellular work, this includes processes like building complex molecules, right? Energy is required for that. Energy is required for transporting materials or powering the motion of different cellular structures like cilia or flagella. It's even required in order to create movement via contraction of your muscle fibers. So that's the first kind of law of thermodynamics. The second law relates to entropy. So before we can talk about the second law, we have to kind of first address what entropy is. Entropy is a measurement of or degree of randomness or disorder that occurs in a system, right? So it's the amount of or degree of randomness of energy within that system. The more random a collection of matter, the greater its entropy. In general, gases have more entropy than liquids. Liquids have more entropy than solids. Now, when you go through different energy transfers, they manipulate the relative entropy or randomness of the environment surrounding them. And this is what's talked about in the second law of thermodynamics. So the second law of thermodynamics states that every energy transfer results in increased entropy. So every time energy is transferred, it increases the randomness in the universe. And the reason why that is the case, or why that exists, is because when you have the transfer of energy, that transfer involves some loss of energy that's lost in an unusable form, primarily heat energy. And the kind of release of that unusable form of energy as heat results in increased entropy. So the entropy of the universe is continuously increasing because of the kind of the loss of usable energy and release of unusable energy with each energy transfer. So when we talk about heat energy, this is defined as the energy that's transferred from one system to another that is not work. So you can think of it as the byproduct of energy transfers. It's the byproduct of work. So when I was talking about the trophic systems, I was saying that when an organism consumes another in order to obtain energy, it's only obtaining partial percentage or a partial amount of the actual amount of energy that was stored in the organism that's being consumed. So the consumer only gets a portion of the actual energy that's obtained from its food source. And the reason for that is because some percentage of that consumed energy, rather than being, some of it will be stored, but some of it's going to be lost. Some of it will be lost to the environment as that heat energy. So you, again, think of it as that byproduct of energy transfers. So again, that's where this concept of entropy becomes important, right? So the more energy that is lost by a system to its surroundings, the less ordered and more random the system becomes. So again, the universe has a very high amount of entropy. It's highly disordered because of that continual release of unusable energy forms. But when we talk about living organisms are a bit different. They are highly ordered, and that's kind of a side effect or a product of that cellular hierarchy. So because living organisms are highly ordered, it means that constant energy is required not only to obtain fuel sources or enable work, but also to maintain those low states of entropy or maintain order in living organisms. So that's another reason why we are continuously in need or a requirement of energy. By obtaining energy, it enables or preserves those low states of entropy at the cellular level. All right, so kind of in segue to kind of the next kind of avenue or pathway that will continue on for this lecture is this concept of reactions or energy transfers being either spontaneous, or unspontaneous. And that has to do with entropy. So spontaneous, when we say that a process is spontaneous, it means that that process can occur without any input of energy. It's not that they necessarily occur quickly, but they don't require energy to be put in to allow it to happen. So it's able to occur on its own. And in order for a process to occur on its own, kind of without the help of an outside source, it requires an increase in the entropy of the universe. So if you increase the entropy of the universe, it makes it more hospitable and more likely that these spontaneous reactions can occur. A process that cannot occur on its own is said to be non-spontaneous. It will only happen if energy is put into the system. So, for example, water flows downhill spontaneously, but moves uphill only when energy is put into the system. Like when you have a machine that's actually pumping that water upwards against the force of gravity. Giving you a cellular example, that the passive diffusion of solutes down their concentration gradient, that's a spontaneous process, right? No energy has to be put into that process in order for it to occur. But if you have the when we talk about active transport of solutes, so in order for solutes to move up their concentration gradient, you have to put energy into the system. And for those reactions, it's either ATP that's used as an energy source, or it's kind of this secondary source, meaning it's energy that's released by the diffusion of a different solute. You got a furball face? You okay? Okay. Is energy too exciting for you? He's giving us an example of kinetic energy. He's using energy right now to cough up a furball, which is delicious. Not really. So that's kind of moving into where I'm going next, which is how do we determine which reactions occur spontaneously and which ones do not, which ones require an input of energy. And that goes in part with this concept and notion of free energy. When reactions require initial input of energy in order to operate, we call that energy activation energy. the energy that's associated with a chemical reaction that is available after all of the losses have been accounted for is called free energy. And it's useful for measuring the spontaneity of a system, right? It's the amount of energy that's kind of free for use in the surroundings to allow for spontaneous reactions. And based on the amount of free energy available, you can either have reactions occur spontaneously, or there's not enough of that free energy to enable such. So free energy is also called usable energy, right? It's the energy that's actually available to do work. And well, this is the kind of the energy we talk about when we're talking about quantifying energy transfers. So the kind of the change in free energy goes into again determining the spontaneity, but also how kind of that reaction operates. So the change in free energy of a reaction can either be negative or positive. When you have a negative change in free energy, that's referring to the release of energy. That's known as an exergonic reaction. You can think of and remember it because exergonic is like exit, right? So energy is exiting the system. So again, negative free energy, or if you have a negative change in free energy, that's an exergonic reaction because energy has been released. If there's a positive change in free energy, that's the opposite. So that's an endergonic reaction. That's referring to the consumption of energy. So energy has not been released, it's actually been consumed. So these are reactions where energy needs to be put into the system, right? So your anabolic reactions are endergonic reactions because they consume energy. So they involve these positive changes in free energy. Your catabolic reactions are exergonic because they release energy. So they result in this negative change of free energy. So we signify kind of the change in free energy as this symbol here, delta G. So if you're having kind of this change in free energy where energy is released during a chemical reaction, then your delta G value at the end of that reaction would be a negative number. Again, that signifies that there's been this release of energy. It also means that the products of the reaction have less energy than the reactants because, again, they release some of that free energy during the reactions. So again, think of it one as energy exiting the system. When you have exergonic reactions, right? So that's, again, these energy exit reactions or where you have the release of energy. These are your spontaneous reactions. As that energy is released, it also increases the entropy of the system. So that enables these spontaneous reactions to continue to occur. So one requires the net release of energy, right? That's, again, exergonic. The other requires the absorption of energy from the surrounding or an energy investment. These are your endergonic reactions. So you can see how your amount of or your delta G level or value changes based on whether you have exergonic or endergonic. So here you have a negative delta G because energy is released. Here energy must be supplied, so you have positive delta G. Now, this is not saying that you are kind of specifically changing the kind of amount of free energy. That the amount of free energy isn't necessarily changing. It's whether you're having a positive or I should say, it's whether you're having a loss or consumption of energy. Now, again, that amount of the kind of the change in the free energy, so that the value change, again, is going to determine whether you can have these spontaneous or non-spontaneous reactions based on the amount of free energy that is thus available in the environment. I wanted to see if there was something else I wanted to add. Okay. In general, when you have spontaneous reactions occurring, they'll occur so a movement from an area of instability to a more stable form. So you're going from an area of more free energy, meaning they have a higher G value, higher Gibbs free energy. You're moving during that spontaneous change to an area of less free energy or a lower G. So you're going from greater capacity to do work. You're actually harnessing that capacity, using it, and that transfers you to a kind of a lower energy state that's more stable but has less work capacity. All right, so kind of as noted here, in that spontaneous change, you're having a decrease in the amount of free energy of the system. So you'll have a negative value or a negative change in your delta G, representing a negative change in the availability of free energy. And by doing so, again, it allows the system to become more stable because you're decreasing entropy. Remember, if we're increasing entropy, there's more randomness and less stability. So by harnessing that free energy, you can do work, and you're consuming some of that free energy, which is decreasing entropy. So you're reaching greater stabilization. These are just some examples of kind of that's these spontaneous changes or reactions that are occurring. As I said before, diffusion is an example of a spontaneous process, right? So your solutes will go through passive diffusion when they move from an area of high concentration to low concentration, and that process happens spontaneously. It doesn't require energy. But in doing so, they're going from an area that's less stable and has more free energy to an area that is more stable, less free energy. So you're moving to you're moving from a zone of less stability to a zone of greater stability by decreasing the amount of free energy. You decrease the amount of free energy by consumption, which occurs during that spontaneous change. Now, don't get that confused with kind of an energy input. Remember, spontaneous reactions occur without any additional energy source. So they're able to spontaneously occur because there's enough free energy available in the surroundings. Your unspontaneous reactions require additional energy, energy that or require a greater amount of energy than what's available by the amount of free energy alone. So make sure you have that separation, because that can cause some confusion for individuals. Oops. All right, I think I just jumped a few. No, I didn't. All right, so we're going to stop there. You can follow the second part of this lecture series by just staying tuned and not leaving this page. The next lecture will go into enzymes, where we can start talking about kind of the use of or the role of enzymes as far as changing activation energy and their role in these chemical reactions. So if you're watching this from my Bio 110 class at Keene State, you are just required to watch this lecture video at this time. This is the lecture video that you will do that 3-part activity or 3-part assignment on, where you write 3 things that you learned that you didn't know before, 2 questions that you have, and 1 fact that you found interesting that you also didn't know before. So that assignment is just for this video. We will go over enzymes next week, so don't watch that video for this activity. To all of you who are watching this video, I hope that this helped your understanding in cellular metabolism and how we obtain and use energy, and that you walk away learning something you didn't know before.